Process. This morning, we are going to dig into the Pell Grant specifically and talk about budgeting for that program. We will finish our series right after this at 11. We're going to have some former legislative and executive staff join us to talk about the process from their perspectives. So that will conclude our four-part series, and we hope you can stick around for all of that. But for those of you who are brand new to PMPI or brand new to the session, we do provide professional development for current and future federal higher education policy professionals. So we are not a think tank or an advocacy group. We are teachers, and we invite speakers to come in that role as teachers, and we invite you all to be here as learners and as students. So as I mentioned, this is to give you a foundational understanding of how the federal government budgets for the Pell Grant. We are going to record the session and share the recording for folks who registered but couldn't attend live. We will not be recording the next session. So if you are interested in earning that digital badge, you're interested in that conversation, you do have to attend it live. All right, before I introduce you to our speaker this morning and get started, wanted to remind folks we're going to use the Q&A box as we have been during this series for questions. You can put them in at any time. We will absolutely have time after presentation to get to them, but don't wait. If you have a question and it pops into your head, make sure you get it into the box. Can be anonymous if you'd like, and you can also upvote questions that you would also like to have answered. And we'll also share a PDF of the slides being presented, so you have access to that as a resource as well. Okay, I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and turn it over to him. Ben Miller is joining us. Ben is the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education, where he has served for the last 4 years. During his time at the department, he worked on a range of federal regulations and executive actions related to federal student loans, college affordability, accountability, and other issues. And prior to the department, he was the Vice President for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. So we're happy to have Ben join us to talk about the Pell Grant. I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we will get to your questions. So Ben, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Betsy, and good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's having a nice Thursday. I am going to share my screen, so just bear with me one quick second here. So today we're going to talk about the Pell Grant program. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes first on essentially how the maximum award gets determined through appropriations, and then also talk about the way it actually gets appropriated. Because one key thing to understand about the Pell Grant program is that because it operates as an entitlement, it can make for some guesswork in the appropriations process that can lead to some interesting outcomes as things progress year after year after year. So I imagine everyone is familiar with it, but just to make sure everyone is sort of level setting from the same knowledge base. So the Pell Grant is the foundational federal investment to help low-income students attend college. It's a grant, which means it doesn't have to be repaid, unlike student loans. It can be used at about 7,000 plus colleges across the country, essentially every place that has accreditation for undergraduate education only. And again, it operates like an entitlement. So if you are eligible for the grant, you are entitled to it. So it's not like some say state financial aid programs where you have to apply by a certain date. And if you don't apply, you might not, the program might run out of money, things like that. Again, just to make sure we're operating from the same knowledge base, the maximum Pell Grant award for the student aid award year we're in right now, which runs from July 1st to June 30th of the following year, is $7,395 as the maximum. So again, the student who applied and got aid on July 1st and qualified for the maximum gets the same as the student who applied for and qualified for aid, today, with the one caveat that you have to have a full-time course load to get that maximum award as well. You can see the average is a little bit less than the maximum. That makes sense. There's a lot of part-time students, things like that. You do not get the maximum award if you're only attending part-time. About 7 million people get the grant, and that's a pretty key number to understand, especially as we get to some of the appropriations discussions, which I'll get back to as we keep going. And the cost of this is, a touch under $29 billion. To give you a sense, the Pell Grant program, I would say right now has been in a relatively speaking steady state for the last several years. If you were to go talk to the appropriations staff, and I'm not sure who's coming later, ask them what it was like around that Great Recession, they will tell you that that was not the case for many years. Essentially, for a long period of time, we had um, a very, very cheap program. It was costing somewhere in sort of the low teens. We had about five some odd million recipients, a little bit under. And then there was really a gigantic spike during the Great Recession as we saw lots and lots of people turn to college. That sort of established a new baseline for the cost of the Pell program that you can see is far higher than where we were before that. It did, however, come down a lot. So you really see this spike right at the peak of the Great Recession, and then it does recede in cost, but you can see we're still at a sort of steady state higher than we were sort of prior to um, the 2007 year there. So again, just to give you a sense, we've been in a relatively stable environment. That was not the case in the past. And as we'll see at the end of this presentation, it seems possible that we are about to enter a period of turmoil here, but we will have to see a little bit more. So the way the actual award works is what Congress does is when it passes its appropriations bills for the fiscal year, it states what the maximum Pell Grant award will be for the year. And that's pretty key because one thing you'll notice is the way it works is when Congress is appropriating money for it, it's appropriating it for a future school year. And so basically what it's doing is it's saying, this is the money we think is available. This is what we want the maximum award to be. So that is the maximum award. We'll get to this in a second, but essentially from the student side, that's just their maximum award of $7,395. But from the appropriation side, it's actually a combination of both what we call discretionary funding, which is the money that has to be appropriated each and every year by Congress, and then mandatory funding, which is money that is just available because of some prior legislative changes. So to give you a sense, other sort of common discretionary programs would be your Title I formula grants for K-12 schools. Other types of mandatory money would be student loans, Social Security, sort of other entitlement programs where the money is available. The other thing I'll just note is that the maximum award also dictates the minimum award. So it is 10% of the maximum rounded to the nearest $5. Again, that's the minimum award for someone going full time. And this is sort of the key point that you'll see come up a couple times throughout is that because Congress is making guesses about an entitlement funding stream into the future, there was a change made in 2006 that says Congress has to appropriate the amount of money that it estimates it actually needs to provide that funding in the future. So you can't say we're going to declare the Pell Grant costs is $10,000 per student, and we're going to appropriate $2 to pay for it. You can't do that anymore. So whatever you want the maximum award to be, you go to the Congressional Budget Office, and whatever dollar amount they say it is what you then need to make sure is available and appropriated. And again, that's pretty key because we're talking about basically saying this is an entitlement available to somebody in the future. So I touched on this a little bit briefly, but until 2007, the Pell Grant program was completely discretionary. And what that meant was that every single year, if you wanted to increase the award, the appropriators had to find enough money in their budget to essentially increase that. What happened starting in 2007 is we had a couple of legislative changes that took some subsidies away from private banks that used to make loans with a federal guarantee against default and put that into automatic increases to the Pell Grant through mandatory money. And so what that meant was that for several years there, really from 2007 through to 2018, some of the Pell Grant increase was basically due to that additional mandatory money coming in. So it would go up each year, but it would be going up because of that mandatory stream, which meant that it was easier for the appropriators because they did not have to find additional money in the budget to increase the award. And that is one thing I imagine you will hear from the appropriations staff a little bit later is that it's always hard to find additional money. $1 billion in the scheme of a program that costs 29 billion may not sound like a lot, but across all of the various needs and funding streams, finding additional money for programs is really hard. And so basically that change made appropriators' lives easier for many, many years where we saw increases. The way the law was written was that basically after 2018, all of those increases basically stopped. So the money would still be there, but the mandatory money that was driving an increase would not keep increasing the award. And what that meant was that any point after 2018, including today, Congress needs to increase the discretionary funding in order to make the award higher. Um, this probably helps make this make a little more sense concretely. So you can see 2007, 2008, that far left blue chart, it's just discretionary money. That's it. And then you see starting in 8, 9, a little bit of mandatory money comes in, a little bit more the next year, a little bit more the year after that. And you can see that that blue line basically stays constant once we hit that 4860 number until you get to 2018, 19, where it starts going up again. And that's because that red line essentially stabilizes at $1,060 after there's first few years of increases. And so what that means is that as we get past 18, 19, it's really the growth in the blue line that's driving the maximum award, whereas from basically 10, 11 through to 17, 18, it was increases in the red line that drove the maximum award. So again, we've shifted from a world where appropriators didn't necessarily need to go find additional money to increase the maximum award to a world where that's now what they do have to do, which does make their job harder. You will see it was not so easy back in that period of time when the mandatory money was coming in, but the problem they faced there was a little different than the challenge you face now if you want to increase the maximum award. Um, this is the same kind of idea or chart, but this is just showing you in terms of the cost of the program and the funding streams here. So again, you can still see that the bulk of the award really is paid for out of discretionary funding, but that there is that little bit of mandatory money that comes in and tops everything off. This concept of mandatory for discretionary is a bit confusing and a bit weird, but essentially what it is savings from law changes that can then be used to offset some of the discretionary costs. So when you're looking at these numbers in, say, 2011, 12, 2012, 13, we'll get to this a little bit later, but there were essentially changes to some of the benefits for Pell Grants that created mandatory savings, and they were able to use some of that to go back into the discretionary budget. You can see now there's like about $1 billion a year that comes in that way. So it's not a huge sum of money, but again, when you're talking about tight fiscal environments, kind of every dollar helps here to get to the award they want to get to. So I've kind of hinted this a little bit, but I think one really key thing to understand is that the money that Congress appropriates for the Pell Grant every year is not the actual cost of the Pell Grant program. And again, the reason for that is because Congress is essentially saying in the future, so for sort of the next award year that starts, this is what we want the maximum award to be. And because the cost of the Pell Grant program is essentially the size of the award and the number of students, they don't know exactly how many people are going to show up each year. So, for example, when Congress was doing all its appropriations just before the Great Recession, they didn't know, because there was no way to know, that, millions more students were suddenly going to show up. And that matters because the students are entitled to that award. So it does not operate like if Congress says, we want the maximum award to be $7,395. We think we're going to get 6 million recipients. If an extra million recipients show up, they still can get that 7,395. It is not like a zero-sum pot of money, but you eventually have to sort of pay the piper and you have to realize the cost that came about from those unexpected costs. And so what that means is basically if you make estimates and you've been in a pretty steady state for the Pell program, you might be off by a little bit here or there. Like maybe you think you're going to get 6.1 million recipients, but you actually get 6.2, or you think you're going to get 6 million recipients. I'm sorry, 6.1 million recipients, you actually get 6 million. That happens from time to time. It's never perfect, but it's really when you're way off on your numbers that you can run into problems because you've either appropriated way more money than you actually needed or way less than you actually needed. And that's, I think, the key concept to have here is basically when Congress is doing its appropriations and it's guessing, if it turns out that it gave more money than it needed, then you get a surplus in the program. And you roll that surplus, you can roll that surplus over each year. And it just means that, if you ever guess wrong the other direction, you've got a little bit of a cushion. But if you guess wrong and you say, this is what CBO estimates the cost will be, this is how many recipients we have, and you're way off, you will have a shortfall. And that matters because going back to what I was saying earlier about how you have to actually provide the money you need for the program, it means you have to cover that shortfall. You can't just leave it there. If you don't cover the shortfall, then you'd have to either cut the benefits in the program or cut the maximum award. So again, it's a guessing game. And for many, many years, we've been relatively stable. So it's not the end of the world. But when you have kind of these giant unanticipated events like with the Great Recession, you can get a shortfall. And again, that is kind of what we saw. Basically, again, if you have way more people than you expected, sometimes we've also gotten shortfalls because Congress will do things like expand benefits. And so then if you have, more people coming and then getting larger awards, you get, again, a greater cost of the perm than you may have anticipated. And then on the flip side, if you think you're going to get more students than you actually get, or you decrease the benefits, you can sort of reduce the odds of a shortfall because you're essentially reducing the cost of the program. And, what you can kind of see here is that we went through a pretty intense period right around the Great Recession where we did have a very significant shortfall. Ever since that point in time, and if you think back to the chart I showed earlier about how sort of the Pell Grant went like this, we've been running surpluses. And so we have not actually had to deal with a shortfall in the Pell program for many, many years now, which is, again, good. Although it does seem, and we'll get to this in a second, that uh, that era of stability in the surplus may be coming to a close. So again, you can kind of see here we went from big shortfalls to relatively large surpluses that have been then largely maintained for roughly a decade. Um, just to give you a sense, what happened there when you go back to these numbers and you look at like that 2010 figure is you basically had kind of a concurrent set of events where you had that big enrollment spike that came from the Great Recession, where again, a lot of people turned to college as a way to go back and get retraining. There were not a lot of jobs available, things of that nature. At the exact same time that other legislative changes Congress had made in 2007 and 2008 increased both the maximum award by a good bit and also expanded some of the benefits available to people. So if you think about it, more people, better benefit, and more ways to get the benefit kind of supercharges your costs very quickly. And this is essentially what we saw was that, when the department looked at what was causing those big shortfalls in the Great Recession, a big chunk of it was due to just more people showing up, which is, good, but you have to pay for it. And then some of it was due to increases in benefits. So the 25% in purple here is due to the maximum award going up. The 22% was due to this thing Congress created called year-round Pell, which was essentially designed to help students get credit for summer courses during Pell. Um, and then 14% was due to some more technical changes to needs analysis that, again, helped more people get larger awards. And all of these things hit at once. And they basically had to make changes to the program to help address that. So some of that was rolling back some needs analysis changes. They got rid of the year-round Pell Grant. It did eventually come back in a form. And then the other thing that happened was we saw a big decline in enrollment following the Great Recession. So when you go look at enrollment, particularly in community colleges and for-profit colleges, it fell a good bit from where it had been. And that's sort of a combination of factors. Some of that is um, there was a big crackdown on some private for-profit colleges. Some of that is those are a lot of students in both those types of schools where if there's jobs readily available, they may be more likely to do that rather than go to post-secondary education. And, some of it's also demographics in terms of how many people in your sort of prime college age population are around. And so the result of all of that is that, we have about 2 million fewer people that are getting Pell Grants today than were in the peak of that Great Recession. And so, we went from around 9 million to about 7 million in terms of recipients. The other thing along the way is that Congress did not sort of drastically scale back the funding for the Pell Grant program, even as the number of recipients was lower than it had been. And so the result of that was for many years, the surplus was growing a little bit as Congress was sort of appropriating enough money for a slightly larger program than it actually was. This got a little complicated because over time they would do things like rescind part of the surplus to pay for things and things like that. So it wasn't like the surplus just grew unchecked, but it did mean that essentially we were in a situation where we had enough money to both sustain the Pell Grant and even you saw them increase the maximum award a good bit over the last several years. So the big question then is, well, what's going to happen in the future? And here is where things get potentially tricky. So, and CBO, basically what they do is they create something called a budget baseline. And the one that came in June 2024, which is the one that's currently being used for the appropriations for FY25 that Congress is currently working on, says we're fine. They say we've got an $11.4 billion surplus going into this appropriations cycle, and so we should be okay. However, when you look at what they did to drive this, and we'll actually show the real documents in a second, and Betsy, when I get to the next slide, if you can start putting stuff in the chat, um, that was based upon an assumption by CBO that we were going to have actually less than 6 million recipients. I don't know exactly what drove that. I assume part of that is an assumption that there would be some effect of the issues with the free application for federal student aid or FAFSA, potentially driving lower enrollment than expected. So when CBO put out the official baseline estimate, it had in there only 5.9 million recipients and said, at the rate we've been going, that's a big surplus. However, a couple weeks ago, they put out some revised estimates. And those revised estimates say, actually, based upon what we're looking at now, we think the program is at risk of a $2.7 billion shortfall. So that is a big change in situation. The good news is for the appropriators, this document that came out in January of 2025 is not the official baseline. So they are still doing all their appropriations work from that $11.4 billion number. But what it does, it sends a big warning signal that the next time we get an official baseline, we are probably going to be looking at a shortfall number. So I've asked Betsy to send around in the chat kind of where you can find these actual documents. And I am going to just kind of show you what they look like because I think it's useful to understand kind of what you're looking at when you're looking at things. So again, this is the official baseline. So this is what came out last June. Down here, I highlighted this number that is them saying like, this is what we think the surplus is going into the fiscal year 2025 appropriation cycle. And you can see kind of throughout this whole period, they've got big estimates for um, a surplus. You can see it shrunk a little bit. We were at a peak of like 14.6 billion and went down a little bit, but it's still there and we still look okay. But then this is what came out in January where you can see all of a sudden things have flipped. And basically what you see in particular is that 11.6 billion figure for 2023 all of a sudden shrinks down to 3.5 billion in 2024 and then flips negative in 2025. And so again, this is not the official baseline appropriators have to work from, but it is strongly suggesting that when CBO goes and updates its baseline, we are going to be facing a shortfall. I want to include one more piece here just so you can see it that again, part of what happened is that they, when they put this baseline together, projected only 5.9 million people getting a Pell Grant in 24. And that would have been a very major decline in the enrollment, which, there was clearly a lot of hand-wringing over FAFSA and some concerns about enrollment declines. I think that's what was built in here. But as we've seen, that didn't occur. And so this is a really good example of what I was talking about earlier about how when you're budgeting into the future and you make assumptions about who you think is going to show up, if you get it wrong, the situation can change very quickly in a very significant manner. And that looks like what we're headed for here. And just to give you a sense, if you take those numbers I showed earlier, the January numbers, and project them forward with sort of level funding, you very quickly get to very significant shortfalls in the program. Which, if that happens, they'll need to do something, either appropriate a lot of additional money. And what makes this particularly hard is you're talking about appropriating additional money just to keep the program where it is. So it's not like let's look at that 2025 number again, which is not what they're going to have to deal with now, but if they did, you'd have to find $2.7 billion just to give the same award you gave everybody last year. So you're not actually increasing the money that any individual student can get, which makes it again a harder sell. And same thing, you're looking out to 2028, you're looking at basically doubling what you have to spend in order just to keep things in a steady state. But again, this is all a projection, and this is sort of an important caveat to take away, which is that, what happens here really is a function of what continues to incur with enrollment. If enrollment slides back down, these numbers either get a lot less red, they probably don't flip back into the blue, but they definitely get smaller. If way more people than expected show up, the numbers in red here get a lot bigger. And that's in some ways part of the challenge that appropriators have to face is that, we have been in a period of relative stability with Pell, where because we had so much money in the program from the Great Recession and made some changes, we largely avoided shortfalls. But as enrollment has ticked back up over the last several years, we are now staring down a higher likelihood of a shortfall. And so the real question, I think, or the real place where the rubber is going to hit the road is probably going to be the 2026 appropriation cycle. Because again, the baseline they're using right now is still showing a surplus, but it seems highly likely that by the time we get the 2025 baseline, we will be seeing a shortfall and they'll have to deal with that in 2026. Whether or not they're going to do anything about that in advance, I don't know. I can't speak to that, but it does look like we are sort of at the end of this period of stability and really highly likely to see a shortfall. But again, if enrollment really declines or something, maybe not. But sort of I think the betting money at this point would probably be on a shortfall in 26. So that was a fair amount. I saw some questions pop in, but I will admit I don't know how to look at those live while share my screen. So
Okay.
the,
I'm
the,
gonna jump to those. So, and continue to put them in, y'all, if you have them. But we actually had a couple Pell related questions that came up in prior sessions. So this group has done an overview of the budget process and the appropriations process. And I kept them on wanting to ask you about them. So I'm gonna do those first, and then we can jump into the chat. And some of them I think are particularly relevant to what you just talked about, and that's the surplus shortfall issue. So someone was curious about the surplus isn't protected, so to speak, to just be used for Pell. It could be reallocated. Is that true?
yes. I mean, generally speaking, when they've done rescissions from it in the past, they've largely used it, I think, to either shore up additional Pell so that they don't need to necessarily appropriate as much in the discretionary budget, or I think it stayed within the student aid account. I'm honestly not sure that they've actually spent it on anything in particular. So they have largely not. They've taken money out of it over time, but they've largely not taken large sums of money out of it, and it's largely stayed within Pell. I mean, I think the appropriators do a nice job of keeping a long view of these things, and they know that if they were to say, 3 years ago, taking $10 billion out of Pell, they would have created a world of basically a massive headache for themselves pretty quickly. So they've definitely taken some, but they've been, I think, relatively judicious about it. And not, to my knowledge, it has not gone to pay for other things in, it sounds like you guys covered this, but obviously the appropriations billing includes Pell, also has labor and health and human services. So there's a humongous amount of stuff in there. And to my knowledge, they have not, generally speaking, taken it to pay for some random thing at HHS or whatever.
Yeah. Another thing we talked about was OMB projections versus CBO projections for other uh, aspects of the budget process. So I thought I would ask that here. Someone wondered how, and to the extent you can answer this, how do they project how many people might need Pell? Is that formula or any of that process public if someone is curious about one, how that even works, and two, someone was curious about like why would OMB and CBO ever be different?
So years and years ago, the Pell model that OMB, really the Department of Education with OMB uses, I believe used to be public, or at least you could sort of go in and mess around with it a little bit. That has not been the case for like more than a decade, though, maybe even 15 years. So I'm not totally sure what caused them to take it down, but it's not really there. But it's a combination of factors. I mean, you look at um, sort of demographically, what are you expecting with enrollment? You look at past trends, how accurate were we last time? How many more people showed up? The other part that's like a little bit tricky right now is that obviously, fairly recently, Congress changed the rules in terms of the exact way we calculate the eligibility awards. And so there is going to be probably some degree of um, kind of uncertainty as they work through that and like what does that look like? How does that affect things? So, I think some numbers that the prior administration put out last year was showing that like a couple 100,000 more students were going to get the maximum award than was anticipated before and things like that. So that's how you get some of it. Um, they differ all the time. I would, sorry, the CBO versus OMB ones differ all the time. I mean, I would admit I'm a little more familiar with it on the loan side, where there's a couple key things there in particular that are different, both I think the number of years they use and the treatment of loans when you what we call consolidate them, which means you basically kind of take all your loans and shove it into one new one. Those in particular drive a lot of differences, but some of it can also just be the timing of when they're putting this together versus when these things come out. So, the president's budget comes out roughly every February. The first year of administration, it tends to be a little later, but the numbers in that often lock more like January-ish. You can see here the baseline they're using is more in June. Um,
Mm.
Delays in the appropriation cycle can also leave it out. So, you know, uh, when it's not uncommon if you look at some of the older budgets from OMB, they're writing the budget and they're freezing stuff before Congress has actually finished that year's appropriation. So sometimes they're basically saying, we think this is what Congress is going to do, but if Congress does something different. So there's just some sort of temporal differences. And then the final thing I'll say is, the president's budget has proposals in it for what do they want to do. So often, if you look at it, say like prior Biden administration budgets called for big increases to Pell. And so you would see in their costs baking that in to say like this is what we want. But the CBO version is not going to include that because the CBO version is just sort of looking at roughly steady state. They're not going to be including, say, like discretionary increase to the maximum award. They did do when the mandatory money was going up in terms of the maximum award, they would include that. But the discretionary one, they're not going to build in there a like, what if you increase the award $500 or whatever.
Right. And related to that, this is the last question that I held over from prior sessions, but related to that, so if, obviously there's plenty of push out there to increase Pell, um, but does that equate, so like a general big picture answer to this, if you want to increase Pell by $500, does that automatically equate to a $500 increase in the Pell budget? Or like how could folks think about what the budgeting aspect of this is if with increases to the award itself? I mean, it's not a one-to-one.
Yeah, I mean it gets tricky because not everybody gets the maximum award, right? So again, what makes it a little bit weird is there's a concept called like a scheduled award, and that basically says, this is what you would be eligible for if you go full time for the full year. So there's plenty of people who are scheduled for the maximum award, but they're a working adult or whatever, and so they go part time. So their actual award might be half of what their scheduled award can be. Um, it's hard to tell because basically, I would think about it as you increase the maximum award, and that means that the person who was already getting the maximum award gets more money. So like that's one part of the cost, right? Like the $500 times the, I don't call it 2 million, 3 million people who get the full maximum award. Um, but then that trickles down, right? So everybody potentially gets a little bit more money, and how much of that $500 they see is going to vary, right? So if you're a part-time or a half-time student for the full year, it's 250, not five. The other part that makes it tricky is obviously you might see more students show up or fewer students show up, which affects the numbers. And then on top of all of that, generally speaking, and here I will be try to be a little careful because I don't know exactly how changes to the aid formula may have affected this, but historically, the way the Pell Grant formula worked was if you increase the maximum award, potentially people at slightly higher incomes. We're not talking like rich, but like it might be if you're at 40 instead of 35K a year or something, you could start becoming eligible for a minimum award. And so that will also have an effect of basically pulling some additional people in as well. So it's pretty hard to do like a one-to-one. I would say probably the best thing to do is go and look at how the average has changed over time. And that probably gives you some sense is like if you look at that chart that was showing sort of program cost, recipients, and then if you take the average award, which I don't think I had in this version, but that would give you some sense of how the dynamics work. But it's hard to say it's like a one-to-one. I mean, there's a reason why these things are like complex models that CBO and OMB use to estimate these things.
Thank you. Okay, I want to jump into the Q&A box because we have some questions coming in. I'm going to start with, I think one of the most important things I'm hoping folks take away is also it's a complicated budget story, right? But there's this mandatory side, there's this discretionary side. So if someone asks, is there a push to make all the funding for the Pell on the mandatory side? Would that be more sustainable? Would that offer some protections? Is there a push for that, or is that if we're okay with how it is? Is there any
Yeah.
discussion?
There had been discussion about it a long time ago. So, like when Congress was removing the subsidies for the private banks from the system, which was like '08 to 10, kind of the peak of that fight, or really 7 through 10. There was some discussion of it. It never got very far, I think, for a couple of different reasons. So, one is um, generally speaking, if you wanted to do something like that, you would need to pay for it, which means you'd have to pay for that cost of moving all of Pell into the mandatory side. And one thing that makes that tricky is that because discretionary appropriations happen every year, even though like it's a solid bet that Congress will appropriate roughly the same amount of money each year, you can't book those savings if you're trying to make a legislative change to move things into the mandatory side because you can't have sort of the future discretionary appropriations having their hands tied that way. So that mechanically makes it a little bit tricky because you can't just say, yeah, look, we were going to appropriate $24 billion a year into a perpetuity on this thing. Let's just shift that into mandatory. It does not quite work that way. Um, you know, it would have its pluses and minuses were it to happen, which I think is again extremely unlikely um, from a sort of legislative standpoint. But if you were, it'd have its pluses and minuses. So the pluses would be you no longer have to have these big fights every year to find additional money for Pell. You wouldn't have to work. This concept of a surplus or a shortfall wouldn't be relevant anymore. You wouldn't need to worry about that. On the flip side, um, you wouldn't have, unless you did it a certain way, which again would increase your costs, you wouldn't necessarily have a way to increase the award again without a big statutory change. So I think about it, if you were to do it, you probably need to do it and then also build in some sort of like inflation adjustment into it, which would cost you more in the moment because if you didn't do that, you would then have sort of a mandatory award, but it never changes. So, for example, Social Security has like inflation increases built into it, which increases your costs when you first do the thing. Um, the appropriation staff, I mean, I think if you told them you could free it up and keep that same money in the baseline, they would love that because that would give them a lot of money to reallocate elsewhere. If you just took it out, it's a little bit agnostic because it doesn't really make their lives easier. But, I think there's a lot of arguments for it because a lot of people say, Pell Grant's an entitlement. It's kind of like Social Security. If you're eligible, you get it. It's a little bit weird to budget a de facto entitlement as a discretionary program. Because again, like there is some guessing games and you get stuff wrong, not because you're trying to, but just you make mistakes. But I think getting from here to there is pretty challenging, especially because you need a lot of money to do it.
Yeah. So somebody asked about short-term Pell and how it fits into all of this. So obviously, there's a lot of talk of that in the community these days. Is short-term Pell, is that part, if short-term Pell were to be expanded, for instance, to include even shorter term programs or other types of programs, how would that affect the appropriations? What additional appropriations need to be made? Like, how does it fit in to the budgeting process?
Yeah, so you would be increasing your costs. So you would need to, in a world of a surplus, probably not the end of the world, but in the world of a shortfall, you'd have to find the money for it. Um, you might also need to find potentially a little bit of mandatory money if you are doing it through authorizing, because if any of that money is going to come from the mandatory side, like those costs would also go up as well. But yeah, I think the estimates have been a little all over the place here. I've seen stuff in like the mid hundreds of millions to stuff that's like over a billion or two, but it would increase those costs. So you would think about it as, again, if you're looking at a shortfall, you might need to find a billion or 2 billion or something extra dollars, which could be, again, more challenging in a world with a shortfall. So basically, and that's true of anything. You could think about it as, you add short-term Pell. You could think about it as you increase the maximum reward. You could think about it as saying, if you go halftime, you can get 75% of the maximum reward. Now, anything you do that essentially sends more money out the door to either uh, more people or people who weren't previously eligible or anything like that, that increase your cost, and you have to sort of bear the cost of that somewhere.
So somewhat related, somebody asked about sustainability of this funding model. And I feel like you've sort of talked about that a little bit, but is there anything else you want to add in terms of, there's push the community, increase the Pell. So let's assume college continues to get more expensive. We know the purchasing power has decreased in terms of how much the Pell covers. Is this a sustainable way to budget for the Pell, given how important it has become to students pursuing higher ed?
Um, I guess like two things I would say on that. So one is obviously we have managed to keep the award there. There were some cuts around the Great Recession. Some of those kind of came back. So I, despite all its chaos involved in it, not chaos is not the right word, but so despite all the complexity involved in it, it has largely worked. At the same time, we are looking at potentially very large shortfalls. And right now, when the shortfalls happened the last time, as I was talking about, you had sort of this perfect storm of like a big unanticipated spike in enrollment and some benefits changes. And so that gave you sort of off ramps to your problem in the sense of it wasn't unreasonable to expect that enrollment might sort of crest and come back down because we know that a lot of enrollment, especially for low income students in the types of places that we're seeing big gains, is countercyclical. The benefits changes that were made could be either rolled back partially or entirely, things like that. Right now, we're not really having any of that go on. So we are seeing some increases, but they're relatively speaking pretty minor. The Pell Grant did go up by a couple $100, but as a general maxim, I assume the goal is to not decrease that maximum award if you can at all avoid it. So you don't have as many kind of like logical ways to solve it that would inflict less sort of hard choices, right? So, if you think that enrollment's going to fall back and you might only need to deal with this for a year or two, and we just think demographically we're going to end up with 300,000 fewer people or something, then you have a little bit of an off ramp, but your off ramp options here are not as good. And so, I don't know what that's going to mean for future appropriation cycles. Um, Again, I would sort of assume there's going to be a goal of preserve the maximum award, and if that requires sort of underlying benefit cuts, do it that way rather than an overall reduction. I think the max Pell award only went down like maybe once sometime in the 90s. So, I would say it seems to me like a little bit of a harder job for appropriators in that they don't have sort of logical money from within Pell. Now, obviously, you could imagine a world where there's a reconciliation bill or something that takes money out of the loan program and puts it into Pell. Because that is the other thing that we did see in the past. We used to have these subsidized loans for graduate students when the Pell Grant faced a big shortfall. Part of how they paid for it was getting rid of those. So there is money elsewhere in the loan program you could potentially pull in, but I don't think you have sort of very easy off ramps within Pell at the moment.
Yeah. Somebody asked about specific legislation, the Pell Grant Preservation Expansion Act. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think the summary was moving, moving funding to the mandatory side, expanding the program substantially in terms of the amount of the award and some other pieces. So I don't know that we need to comment on that specific legislation, but can you give us a summary of sort of what changes have happened to Pell? When we've talked about it's increased, but any other significant changes to the Pell Grant eligibility, the number of people who have been able to receive Pell? Can you give us a sense of what has changed in the Pell over the past number of years? Right, with like the new SAI, we have increased eligibility, it seems. Are more people getting Pell? Like what has been happening over the past decade or so that has been significant for Pell changes?
Yeah, I mean, probably the rewrite of the aid formulas or sort of the needs analysis formulas that happened, I think that's the end of 2020. There's a couple years that blur together in my mind there, but those are probably the biggest in the sense of they didn't necessarily radically expand eligibility for the grant in the sense of like, I think that some additional people became eligible, but it wasn't massive. But what it partially did was also give a path for more people getting Pell to get the maximum award. And that has a cost element to it. I will admit, I don't remember all the mechanics of it off the top of my head, but I think one reason for that is they instituted a sort of automatic income threshold where it was basically like if you're at this percent of the poverty level, you will just automatically be eligible for the maximum award, which I think is part of it. I imagine there's some other changes that I just don't know as much about sort of under the hood there. But so obviously, anytime you do stuff like that, like if you change needs analysis to say, it's easier to qualify for the maximum award so that someone who was maybe qualifying for $6,000 now qualifies for $7,300, like that's a cost. And one of the jokes I always use here is that you take thousands of dollars and millions of people and you get big numbers very fast. And things that can seem very minor, like $500 increase for 2 million people or something, can be very significant very, very quickly. Going back even further than that, probably the other one was we had sort of the reintroduction of a year-round Pell option for people that had a pretty minor cost to it. Um, and really, I think what you're looking at now is just you sort of see when you go back to those earlier slides I had that from 18 onward, they did increase that discretionary base by, I forget the exact number, but it's basically we went from 4860 to 6335. So that's a pretty sizable increase in the discretionary base that you then have to make up as the program increases. And again, it's very easy to increase the discretionary base when you're getting fewer and fewer recipients because it doesn't really like it costs you something, but you could imagine those two numbers, roughly speaking, netting out. Like I increased the award, but I've got fewer people, so I can kind of make them work together. But now, if you've got an increased award or even a flat award and increases in the number of people, that will create some challenges for you.
Yeah. Can you give a sense for, I know people are interested in this, increasing the Pell amount. We've had several questions on that and not necessarily related to specific legislation, but do you have a sense for appetite in Pell increases? Is this a bipartisan supported program? Thinking about a lot of these folks on the call are students or advocates or policy researchers. What is the general consensus about the value of Pell, would you say, in the from the eyes of the legislative or executive branches?
I mean, I think historically it had pretty good bipartisan support. I think the sizes of the increases tended to be bigger when you had sort of full democratic control of the appropriation cycle. But you did see some years when split government resulted in some funding increases. Um, you know, the push for like fully mandatory Pell or sort of big expansions outside of short-term Pell has largely been, I think, a relatively partisan thing. Although sometimes what you see here is there's some stuff that's like partisan, but quietly less of a big deal than things that's like overtly aggressively partisan, if that makes sense. Like I will fight you on it, but like, yeah, okay, versus like I really dislike this thing and I will fight tooth and nail on it. Um, if you're staring down a world of a hypothetical, like, I don't know, cutting money from the graduate loan program to put into Pell. I don't know how those dynamics play out. Obviously that's like a little bit different than just sort of an unpaid for increase. Obviously, short-term Pell has a lot of bipartisan support for it, but would result in some cost increases in the program. The challenging part sometimes is because so much of this is appropriated through discretionary work, you don't always bear the immediate cost of changes you make. So like you have to bear some of it, but like let's say you do short-term Pell and you get it totally wrong and like you get 3x the number of people you expected or whatever, you'll get that problem then down the road in your appropriation cycle. And then the question becomes like, what is the bipartisan solution to fixing it? But generally speaking, the way the appropriations process works, all the bills have to be bipartisan. There's not enough to do a solely partisan bill because of the filibuster in the Senate. And so, again, increases tend to be bigger when you've got one party control of things. There has been generally pretty good support for it. How much that changes as we've seen more partisan feelings about education overall and things like that, I don't know. Obviously, there is very bipartisan support for short-term Pell right now.
Well, speaking of short-term Pell, another question came in, and this maybe is a process question. So if legislation, were to pass that expanded short-term Pell access, does how, and we're already in sort of a budget cycle, would there be additional funding added to Pell appropriations? Do they have to make it work with what's already been allocated in this budget year? How might that work? The question.
You would have to appropriate more money for it. If you did this a few years ago and you had the surplus, you could maybe do a rescission from the surplus to help pay for it. But back to that change they made in '06, which is called the Pell Grant scoring rule. You can just sort of say, "Oh, we just did this new thing in Pell. It doesn't cost us anything. We don't have to do it." Anything you set in Pell, you have to pay for. So if you were to do short-term Pell, you would need to find some sort of offset. And I think that's why if you look at, I think there was maybe a House bill where the offset was like, maybe it was funding the Ivy League schools or something like that. I forget exactly what it was. I don't know as it worked its way through the process. I think they changed the offset. I don't remember entirely, but you would have to find a way to pay for it. So you can't just sort of declare, hey, we've expanded the Pell Grant short-term programs and there's no cost to bear. You would need to find a way to pay for that in the moment.
And I will say in our panel, our second panel today, we are going to talk about some of those trade-offs and how you think about them as an appropriator, specifically. So, because I do think that's worth talking about. I'm curious about, we talked earlier this week about we are coming up on a deadline for the budget. If we fail to pass a budget or we continue on with continuing resolutions, how does all of that impact Pell Grant funding, or does it at all?
Um, so if there's, let's say they just end up doing a full year continuing resolution, because of that June 2024 baseline, we wouldn't really have a problem. You would just end up with essentially the same Pell Grant as students have for this year, and things would sort of be fine. In 26, if you did that, that's probably a better question for the appropriation staff, but I'm not sure that would work because you have a shortfall in the program. So you can't just carry on like a continuing resolution means sort of the funding is flat from what it was or the same as it was the year before. And so there, I don't think you would. have the same ability to just sort of say, and there's no consequence. So I believe that's right. I would double check with them, but if it happened this year, you would just have people stick with the same maximum award. And because you've got that June 24 baseline that shows a surplus, you'd be okay.
Right. One final clarification question. I don't want to ignore this person. Just to put a finer pin on it, money in surplus, Pell surplus, it can be saved for years when there is a shortfall.
Yeah, I mean, basically that's what they've been doing is they've been essentially rolling it over. I mean, the way it technically works is you're probably taking the shortfall, spending it, and then just like appropriating more than you need. But that's basically what's been happening. And essentially, if they hadn't have done that, we would have faced a shortfall earlier. So like you see in some of those CBO numbers, they show that the surplus shrunk. And when the surplus shrinks, basically what that means is that they actually did not appropriate enough money in that year, but they had the surplus there to help spend it down, or that they sort of rescinded money from it. But that is essentially what's been doing, they've been doing. That's partially why they've been able to sort of avoid the problem that looks like we're now pretty likely to head toward into 2026.
Anymore. Okay. Thank you. That is all the questions. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us